I'd like to turn the tables now, Philip, if I can, and ask you a few questions, because I've recently discovered that you have quite a history behind you of exposure to TOC. Would you be willing to share what your background is with the theory of constraints, and do you have any experiences you'd be willing to share?
Okay, I'm English. I'm an engineering degree. But at the end of my engineering degree, I met a French woman who was going to become my wife, and I began my career in French industry, in the steel industry. And right at the beginning, I discovered something that today we call lean manufacturing, the Toyota way, and that's been one of my passions throughout my career. 3-4 years later, I was hired by what we would call a startup company called Creative Output in 1986, so that's quite a few years ago now, to implement a software called OPT, that was based on the idea that companies could no longer be correctly balanced in terms of capacity, and that all systems had a constraint surrounded by non-constraints, or bottlenecks surrounded by non-bottlenecks, as we call them then. Basically, so over these more than 25 years now, I've been learning about these two things and trying to implement them. And I've done that now, I guess, over 100 times in various industries, always in manufacturing and operations. I wrote a very boring book in French about the theory of constraints in 1994 that described, well, its sales pitches, if you like the goal, this is how you do it, and it was all about implementing theory of constraints in manufacturing. When I wrote that, I had a reading committee and I sent it out, and they said, you can't finish it like that, you have to do something, because what I finished off by saying was, although it was obviously perfect for managing the existing bottlenecks in a company, one of the things that it was lacking was, if I could choose the bottleneck in my process of improvement, where would I locate it? Is there such a thing as a good or bad bottleneck? And that's something that has fascinated me ever since. And more lately, at a more systemic global level, when, for instance, a factory finds it doesn't have enough work, there's not enough demand on the products, the bottleneck is no longer on the factory floor, it's somewhere else in the organization. And if it's in marketing and sales, or is it in research and development, or somewhere else again, that's a different problem to be managed. And but again, the question I ask myself when I see all this is, where should it be? And probably the answer is different whether I'm a manufacturer in India or a manufacturer in America. But I think we should have some, maybe not an algorithm with a perfect answer, but we should know, that's an awful place to have it, and that's a good place to have it. And so that's my story of the theory of constraints. And more recently, I created a consultancy firm 8 years ago now, and all our work is based on the theory of constraints.
Excellent, excellent. Your background with constraint theory obviously goes back long before most of the people who are involved in it now, which is really unique, and I have to say that I have only known one other person who has been involved with that as long as you have, and that's Eli Goldratt. What puzzles you the most about theory of constraints and its progress over the past 30 years? Are there any particular observations or data points that raise questions in your mind?
Well, as I mentioned, I've watched what we call today lean manufacturing, or the Toyota way, grow to what it is today, the predominating way of doing things in operations, and going now into banks and hospitals and everything else. So it's now the main way of doing things throughout the world. And at the same time, over the same period of time, the theory of constraints has maintained its existence, has its organization and its community, but its market share is, I don't know if people can fight about the number, but I would suggest less than 1% of manufacturing and operations. So why? For instance, people say that one of the problems or the blockages that there is with the theory of constraints is cost accounting, and that I don't disagree with at all, but it seems to me that lean manufacturing, or the lean approach, has exactly the same problem. And in fact, right from the initial writings of Daiichi Ono in his first books, he also said he had to ask the accounting people to step aside while he did things, because they would never understand and never validate what he was doing. So if both the theory of constraints and lean had the same blockage, how come in its own way lean got around that, and we still say we have this problem that is preventing us growing? That's one point. The other one is a strange one, which is to do with what I believe is the most difficult thing to do with the theory of constraints, and that what is paradoxically not the constraints, not the focusing on the constraints, that everybody loves to do. They enjoy it because it goes back to our productivity mindset of a long, long time ago, and making lots of noise with the machines. And that goes pretty well. The problem is subordination, or the 80–90% of the system that is a non-constraint, that must not work to its own potential, it must work according to the requirements of the constraint, and therefore learn not to work. That is a big issue, but what is surprising is that lean also has exactly the same issue. That's to say that, for instance, Kanban, to use that part of lean, is a system that tells people when to stop working. It synchronizes production by micro stoppages of manufacturing processes left, right and center to keep things synchronized.
Almost so, like the way the rope chokes off the introduction of work into a DBR process.
Absolutely. Instead of having one big rope, you've got lots of little ropes, and the idea is the same. So they're stopping working just like the theory of constraints, and yet they get away with it. I think I know the answer to that one. It's because it's a lot less visible. It's a lot of small stoppages left, right and center, and it's not presented in such let's say, an aggressive or direct way. But the logic is the same. Lean synchronizes by stopping work.
I would agree with that, because all of the teaching examples and the discussions of drum buffer rope, for example, focus on the entire production line and treat it as an entire system and look for the constraint within that line, and everything else is non-constraints. And so we get to focus on that one issue to the exclusion of almost everything else, when often the most problematic part is how do you effectively manage the slack capacity in the system. When I first got my exposure to DBR, which is back in 1994-95, the person who helped me to understand that best was a professor from Baylor University's business school, particularly production, by the name of Van Gray. And Van was probably one of the smartest guys I have ever known in how to apply DBR and why things worked and why things didn't, and connecting it to the 5 focusing steps and all of that. And he made it very clear to me up front that step number 3, the subordination, he said, that is the hardest step in the entire process, the most difficult to do. And we didn't get into great detail about it at the time. I just accepted his word at it, and it took me quite a while to realize exactly the implications of that statement. So I would agree with you. I think that the subordination is really problematic.
Well, there are many things there. I could talk about that for a very long time. One of them is if you really want to break out through with a beautiful solution with regards to this subordination problem, you have to create a culture in which when people stop working, they do something with value added that is not production, problem solving, improvements and so forth. And if you have a history of basically having a labour force that's just there to produce and not allowed to contribute to any kind of continuous improvement, then it's shocking whenever they stop, because they're just going to open a newspaper or sit around doing nothing. When another organisation with the same mechanism can say, okay, now you're stopping, so but you're going to do some maintenance on the machine or try and solve that problem. So there are many things in there. The other thing I find fascinating with that subordination issue is we do about half our work in manufacturing and drum buffer rope, and the other half in projects with critical chain. And the surprising thing is, it is easier to deal with the subordination issue in critical chain than it is with drum buffer rope. And I was trying to work out why. It took me a while. I think it's quite simply because it's a lot more visible in manufacturing than it is in projects. In manufacturing, the flow and the machines, you can see when they're stopped and they're not producing.
That's true.
And it upsets you. Whereas exactly the same logic will appear in critical chain projects, but you won't see it. You can walk through an office. You can work through an office and everybody's there in front of their computers, and even though you've implemented critical chain, and some of them are non-bottlenecks with 40% excess capacity, it won't hit you in the face like that. And that's extraordinary. It's extraordinary because in projects, because there are no time per parts or hard data about how long it's going to take to do this and that, the disequilibrium in capacities is a lot more important than in manufacturing. And I found cases where some parts of the organisation doing projects had 4 times more capacity than they really required, because it wasn't apparent, because, you know, with Parkinson and everything, you can always make it look as if you're busy. So you could have expected it to be more difficult to do subordination projects, but finally, because it's invisible, it isn't, but it's still there, and it's fascinating to see how this is still a problem.
Are there some key unanswered questions that you can think of that you have heard from others about TOC? Think questions that you find are perhaps a little challenging to respond to in an effective way?
I think that there are many questions. You know, it's this kind of subject where the more time you spend doing it, the more questions emerge, but let's keep it to 2 for the moment. I think one of the things that I find worrying today is that we no longer have a clear process for identifying the constraint. We have the 5 focusing steps, and step 1, first thing you're meant to do in the theory of constraints is identify the constraint. I can do that in a robust fashion in manufacturing processes. It's quite easy. You look at where the whip is piling up and stuff like that. I can do it fairly well in project areas where you end up looking again at where the projects are getting queued up. But what happens when, and this is more and more the case, the constraint is somewhere else again? When it's not on the factory floor, how do you find it? If it's in marketing, or if it's in research and development and new ideas and so forth. So that worries me, because I think, obviously, I agree with the first step. You have to find the constraint, but I've been challenged a few times about where it was exactly. And it's particularly hard when the organisation is either destabilized because it's losing money and not going well, or it's been through so many changes in management and stuff that things are all deconstructed. And I find that quite a challenge to identify where the constraint is. So that would be the first point. The second is something, as I say, that has been troubling me now for 20 years. I believe that we have a missing half, or a second half of the theory of constraints, which is to be able to have a point of view on where a constraint should be in an organisation. The focusing steps is an iterative process that will take the constraint wherever it is and move it to somewhere else, wherever that may be. It will never stop and say, have I got it in the right place now, or is this a stupid place to have it? And I think that people who want to do theory of constraints for decades, rather than going through iteratively, you know, it's gone there, 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 should be capable of saying, okay, life is better, we're stronger, we're more robust, and we make more money when we put it here. And therefore I want to have the constraint there, I want it to have that capacity, and I want to have so much excess capacity around it.
I think that's an excellent point. In my experience, Eli Schragenheim was very well aware of this issue when he created simplified drum buffer rope back in the mid-1990s, and he educated me on that particular problem. But there are not that many people, because it was never really became a mainstream issue. There are probably not many among the practitioners that ever give that any thought. The 5 focusing steps, as you observed, are intended to find the constraint where it is and exploit it or break it where it is. What I believe we need is another 5 focusing steps, maybe not numbered 1 through 5, but maybe A through E, that are intended to determine in a given system where should the constraint be, given the circumstances and the nature of the business that it's in. Where should the constraint be, and how do you get it to go there? I think that that's a fertile area for research in the future.
Yeah, I think so too. So those are the comments on what I see about that.
Well, that's plenty of food for thought, and thank you very much for attempting to address the questions. I realize that it's not as much fun to pose questions as it is to answer them, but it's a lot more difficult many times answering the questions that are posed. But those are all valuable questions to consider, and thank you very much for your time.
Thank you for yours. And,
my pleasure.
Thank you.